An influential teacher, a distinguished theologian, a man who endured many trials, a father of souls, Blessed John Henry Newman remains as fresh and relevant today as he was during his lifetime. And thanks to his many volumes of writings and letters, we can come to see him as a friend and a companion. My name is Father Nicholas Schofield, a priest working in London, and I've admired Newman for as long as I can remember. Together with my friend, Father Marcus Holden, we are going to discover more about his remarkable life and visit some of the places that he knew. So Marcus, it's really good to see you here in Ealing, in Montpelier Park.
Great to be here, and thanks for inviting me. You have roots here.
That's right, I grew up in Ealing, and my school is just over the fence there, and I remember playing in this park as a kid. And when I got older, I was fascinated to discover that Newman also spent his school days in Ealing.
And Newman's had a big influence on both of us, and in fact it was 20 years ago that we both met on a Newman pilgrimage, so it's wonderful that we can do a pilgrimage of our own now and tell the story of the man who's had a massive influence on our lives.
And Newman's own pilgrimage is closely linked to Ealing because here he experienced his first conversion in 1816 and really put him on the road that he would follow during the rest of his life.
So this is a really good place to start.
Absolutely, let's go.
When I was 15, I fell under the influences of a definite creed and received into my intellect impressions of dogma, which, through God's mercy, have never been effaced or obscured, making me rest in the thought of two and two only absolute and luminously self-evident beings, myself and my Creator.
Newman is aware of those two absolute self-evident beings, himself and his Creator.
And that will never be taken away from him. And also that sense that in religion you can find truth, that it's something given, that it comes from God, a definite creed, and that was never erased, as he says.
And also around this time, Newman becomes aware of a calling to the single life, a calling to celibacy, so that he is free from any worldly distractions to follow God's will.
This is part of his conversion. He writes in his famous book, the Apologia Pro Vita Sua, which is the story of his life, that he was freed at this time from a life of vice. And I think it sounds a bit incredible because he couldn't have been doing anything horrendous. And yet it seems from his writings that he was imbibing a worldly spirit, a secular spirit, and following a way of life according to that. And this was a moment of change.
And when you think of your own life, I mean, since playing in this park as a small child, so much has changed. But for Newman, his life is such a unity. There's such a consistency through his life, certain themes like creed and dogma and a sense of God's presence in his life, providence, all these things can be found right through his life from a very early age.
It's like a symphony, isn't it? And
movements in the symphony.
And the next stage of that symphony is when he went up to Oxford.
To Trinity College.
Teach me, dear Lord, frequently and attentively to consider this truth, that if I gain the whole world and lose Thee, in the end I have lost everything. Whereas, if I lose the world and gain Thee, in the end I have lost nothing.
A year after his conversion, Newman went up to Oxford as an undergraduate at Trinity College. This in itself proved a decisive moment. It was amid the dreaming spires that Newman would remain for the next 27 years as a student, an academic, and a pastor. So it's great to be back in Oxford, a place so closely associated with John Henry Newman.
It's great to be back again, isn't it? And this is the place that really defines Newman. When you think of Newman, you think of Oxford. This is the place that makes him the man that he became.
And it's astonishing, really, how badly he did as an undergraduate at Trinity.
It's rather encouraging, isn't it, that his first degree almost fails, and yet he still becomes this great theologian and world figure.
And there's no sign at that early stage that he would become such an intellectual giant. In fact, it's only later when he becomes a fellow that he refers to his tongue being loosened and coming out of his shell.
That's right, but what is constant is that he has a great faith from that early conversion. But in Oxford he undergoes a second conversion. He realises the need for a church, for structure, for a creed, for Christianity to survive. It's not enough simply to have personal faith.
And a church which is apostolic and a church which is universal.
That's right. It's in Oxford that he discovers what he calls the fathers of the church, the return to antiquity. In this volume, which is the Apologia, it's a first edition, the book about his own religious thinking and development, he says he was reading long extracts of St. Augustine, and he says, I read them as being the religion of the primitive church. And he'd later say that it was Oxford that made him Catholic.
So just behind us is Oriel College, where Newman was a fellow. And in his time, Oriel was really the most intellectually vigorous college in Oxford.
It's amazing that in Oriel College, in the common room, there were intellectual greats like Keble and Pusey.
Hawkins, White, Froude, many others. But against this academic backdrop, Newman is ordained a priest in the Church of England.
And he was a very impressive priest, wasn't he? He would care for the sick and the poor.
And his parish is in a very deprived area of Oxford, St. Clement's.
It's amazing that he had time as an intellectual to do all this pastoral work.
And to visit every single parishioner, which at the time was very, very unusual. And it's not just in the parish that he's a pastor, even in the college as a tutor, he sees his students not just as clever minds, but as a whole person, as individuals with an eternal soul.
Yes, he has a squabble with the master of Oriel because the master wants the student to just be treated academically, but Newman wants to care for the whole person, to be a shepherd.
We've come back to one of our favourite places, the Oxford Oratory, which we knew well as students. And we've come to speak to our old friend, the priest and scholar, Father Jerome Bertram.
Newman's thought developed a long way. When he came to Oxford, he had the basic Anglican religion as it was at the time, a great deal of scripture reading, but he had also absorbed Calvinist ideas from some school teachers who'd been very good to him. The Calvinist idea was that everybody is sorted out before we're created, the very good who will certainly go to heaven, the very bad who will certainly go to hell. When Newman was ordained a deacon, he visited people in his little parish in East Oxford and could not find a single person who was either so good that they're going to heaven or so bad that they're going to hell. He realized that everybody is a bit of a mixture. The Calvinist model just did not work, that human beings have something of good in them and something of bad in them, and his work as a clergyman was to try and bring out the good. So that was the first shake to his ideas of Calvinism. Reading the Church Fathers revealed that there was no shadow of these traditional Protestant ideas in the first 4 or 5 centuries of the Church, or indeed the next 5 or 6, or until you get to the 16th century. The ideas of Protestantism were completely new. The idea of justification by faith alone is not found in the Church Fathers. And so his reading of the early church forced him to realize that Protestantism, as he knew it, was not the teaching of the early Christians. Newman had an amazing trip to the continent in 1832 to 1833. He made a lot of money out of his first published book, which was on the 4th century, and this gave him the opportunity to go on holiday with his friend Harold Froude, who was already suffering from tuberculosis and was deemed to need a different climate. Inevitably, they visited Catholic churches as tourists, and yet at the same time regretting that the Catholic Church was so corrupt because the Roman Catholic Church had left the Church of England in the 16th century. So there's an element of suspicion. They would not attend a service, but they would visit churches. They saw the Pope in Rome, but not to speak to him. They did speak to the rector of the English College, Nicholas Wiseman, who afterwards came back to England as cardinal, and they realized that wherever they went on the continent of Europe, there were Catholic churches, but there were no Protestant churches, that the church throughout Europe, except in a small area of the north, was different. This partly triggered the branch theory, which Harold Froude developed, that in fact the church is divided into its Latin, Greek, and English branches, each of which are equally part of one universal church. That theory collapsed when neither the Latins nor the Greeks would accept it for one moment. The other crucial influence on Newman's development during his holiday was his illness in Sicily. He travelled to Sicily with his friend Harold Froude. The Froudes went back to England, and Newman returned to Sicily alone. He became severely ill in a very remote part of the mountains, almost died, could only communicate with the doctor in Latin. And when he came round, he was saying things like, "I have a work to do in England." And he would never explain quite what he meant by that. He also wrote his most famous poem on the way back, "And in the dawn those angel faces smile, which I have loved long since and lost a while." And one wonders whether that meant he had a near-death experience and was aware of angels. He would never explain those lines. The poem, of course, is "Lead, Kindly Light." And the idea of following the light, wherever it's going to lead, was something that remained important to him.
Newman would have been delighted to see this oratory church in Oxford, but it's very, very Italianate. And when Newman originally went to the continent, he found it all rather shocking, this sort of style and devotion.
Yes, I think he saw a certain corruption. He thought it was superstitious, the devotion that he saw in places like Italy and Malta. And then I think he conceived in his mind the idea that the Anglican Church could be a via media between Protestantism on the one hand and the corruptions of the Roman Church on the other.
Between the two extremes.
Yes.
But this time in Sicily also is very important personally. Surviving this very serious illness, Newman becomes aware that he has work to do in England.
Yes, it's another conversion moment for Newman. This illness that brings him to the point of death and coming back again from that makes him realise he's got to do something for God no matter what the cost. He becomes very docile to the providence of God, and he writes that deep existential poem which becomes a popular hymn, "Lead, kindly light, amid the encircling gloom, lead thou me on."
So from that moment he follows the light of truth.
Which is the theme of his life. As soon as Newman got back from his travels on the continent, he arrived as literally a new man, and he was ready to join that crusade that was called the Oxford Movement. It was a time coinciding with Keble's great sermon on national apostasy.
That's right, and the timing is absolutely perfect. Keble and Newman and others are really concerned about the independence of the church from state interference. There's this bill which Parliament is passing trying to suppress some of the dioceses in Ireland, and that's affecting the independence of the church.
It was called Erastianism, and Newman was fighting that. But the Oxford Movement was also about the rediscovery of doctrine and the importance of early Christianity, linking the modern Christianity with the past to make it more Marian, more Eucharistic, even more sacramental.
And eventually there's a rediscovery of the beauty of holiness and also ritual. But at the fundamental part of this Oxford Movement is a realisation that religion is revealed, and that this revealed religion has to be free.
And this has stuck with Newman. He writes about it, doesn't he, in his Apologia. There's this wonderful passage where he says, "I cannot enter into the idea of any sort of religion as a mere sentiment. This to me is a dream and a mockery." So for Newman, revelation, the creed, is absolutely central, and it was at the heart of the Oxford Movement.
And it runs through his entire life as well. By this time, Newman was vicar at St. Mary the Virgin, both a parish church and the official church of the university. Newman was a prominent figure, and his weekly sermons attracted large crowds. In fact, in modern terms, he had become something of a celebrity.
So here we are at the side of St. Mary the Virgin Church, where Newman preached so many of his famous sermons. It's amazing that the sermons were very dense, and yet they were so popular. And his style wasn't brilliant, at least on paper. I mean, he was reading from the text, he had a fairly quiet voice, and yet everyone was absolutely spellbound. It's quite amazing. You see in those sermons also the seminal ideas of his great works, the Grammar of Assent, the development of Christian doctrine. All those ideas were there in the university sermons. And he's happy for his sermons to be still in print when he's a Catholic. Yes, they were all authentic Christian teaching. And it makes Newman also into quite a celebrity. There's a story about one of his later disciples, William Lockhart, walking along the high street with a companion, and suddenly his companion stops him and says, look, there's Newman on the other side of the road. And Lockhart looked at Newman and was filled with amazement and was completely under his spell. He'd become one of the great Oxford men.
The Oxford movement led Newman more and more towards Catholicism and less towards a via media. Eventually he broke with Keble and Pusey and many of his other friends and retired to a place on the edge of Oxford called Littlemore for prayer, study and discernment. He was soon joined by various like-minded men, some of whom later became important figures in the Catholic community themselves. In this peaceful setting, Newman would undergo another conversion.
Newman was appointed vicar of the University Church in Oxford in 1828. At the same time, he was also vicar of Littlemore because Littlemore was part of the parish of St. Mary the Virgin. So Newman often came to Littlemore 2 or 3 times a week to visit a parishioner, to visit the sick, to instruct the children, and he loved taking care of his parishioners here in the village. He also helped to build a church here and a school. And Newman was vicar here at Littlemore till September 1843, when he resigned his ministry because of his growing doubts about the Church of England. When Newman had made up his mind to join the Roman Catholic Church, he heard that Father Dominic, the Passionist from Italy, would come to Oxford. And Newman, through a mutual friend, John d'Algerns, asked Father Dominic to call in at Littlemore. Dominic Barbary arrived here on the evening of the 8th of October, 1845. He was soaking wet from his journey in the rain. On arrival, Newman didn't hesitate a moment, but fell on his knees and asked Father Dominic to hear his confession and to receive him into the Catholic Church. Newman started his general confession, for which he had been preparing the previous days. It lasted a few hours, and the rite of reception took place on the following evening. Newman had a great influence during his lifetime, which still continues today. His innumerable books are read by many people. Newman continues to be a spiritual guide for many. He enlightens our minds, he touches our hearts. And maybe we can say Newman is a father for the modern church.
Did St. Athanasius or St. Ambrose come suddenly to life? It cannot be doubted what communion he would take to be his own. All surely will agree that these fathers, with whatever opinions of their own, would find themselves more at home with such men as St. Bernard or St. Ignatius Loyola, or with the lonely priest in his lodgings, or the Holy Sisterhood of Mercy, or the unlettered crowd before the altar than with the teachers or members of any other creed.
Well, Littlemore was a place that Newman felt very close to. He'd been a pastor here for many, many years. He built the local church. He was very involved in the schools. And it's here that he retreated to from Oxford in 1842.
It all looks idyllic now, a beautiful place for a retreat, a shrine, and yet when Newman and friends first came here, it was a sad time because they'd been censored. The Oxford movement had hit up against a brick wall. Newman, with his Tract 90, had upset the establishment, saying the 39 articles of the Anglican Church should be reinterpreted or properly interpreted as Catholic, and that was too much for many.
Yeah, Tract 90 was really the sort of straw that broke the camel's back. There'd been lots of controversy over the Tractarians and the things they were saying about the role of the church, the structure of the church, and the relationship between church and state.
And so Newman came here to really preserve the true Church of England and not initially to become a Catholic, but that's where he would end up.
Yes, his conversion certainly wasn't inevitable. In fact, he came here to live a life of regular prayer, study. It was really semi-monastic in many ways, and he really gathered around him a group of young men, none of them particularly his intellectual equal, but people who had the same thoughts as Newman and perhaps needed help. And Newman was very keen to keep them together within the Church of England.
But the influence of this place and that time together, the studies and the writings on the lives of the saints and on doctrine slowly led Newman and his friends to embrace the Catholic faith. So this is Newman's room at Littlemore.
And this is where he spent about, 3 years of his life?
Yes, praying, discerning what to do next. It was a very difficult time for Newman, knowing what the Lord was really calling him to do.
And always the temptation is simply to stay with the familiar rather than taking an adventurous leap in the dark.
Yes, but slowly but surely his studies and of the fathers here were leading him more and more to Rome. He read, as he tells us in the Apologia, the words of Augustine, "Securas judicat orbis terrarum," secure is the judgment of the whole world. He realized that he was being like the Donatists or the Monophysites, schismatics, heretics of the early church, not being with the universal church. And he was being called to move from that.
And those patristic studies looking at the early church really shone a light on his current situation and what he should be doing in the 19th century. But a key part of all this is this remarkable Italian Passionist priest, Blessed Dominic Barbary.
Yes, he's a major hero of Newman's conversion. Barbary was an Italian, a mystic, a man of God, who was a priest in Italy, had visions of the Blessed Virgin Mary calling him to go to England, to work for the conversion of England. His story is like that of a medieval saint. And when he arrives here, he begins very boldly to call people to conversion, but yet he's very humble at the same time, very gentle.
And like Newman, he's also a theologian. He's written quite a few books back in Italy.
Yes.
But he comes here and he works as a missionary and he faces a lot of opposition, especially in the Midlands. I think on one occasion, some young people were throwing stones at him in the street, and he would pick up the stones and he would kiss them and then carry on his work.
Yes, and it's this figure of Barbary who challenges the Oxford men. He writes to them to become Catholic. He writes a lamentation in the fashion of Jeremiah over the state of English Catholicism. And it's this figure of Barbary who really touches Newman.
So he's really touched by the example of a holy priest, not simply his academic readings and his own prayer.
It's surprising that in the end, the clincher for Newman isn't the end of a series of reasonings. It's this holy priest who arrives here and calls him to conversion, because Newman, having met very few Catholics apart from on his travels, had a low view of the Catholic religion. In practice, he said, the Church of Rome has lost her holiness. He believed in Catholicism in every other way, but didn't see the holiness, and it was the example of sanctity that finally clinched it for Newman. There's a wonderful letter over here. It's a copy of the letter Newman wrote on the night that Barbary came, the October 1845. and he says, the Father Dominic, the Passionist, will come, and I mean to ask him to receive me into the one fold of the Redeemer. So important.
And I think by doing that, Newman receives a huge amount of peace, a peace of heart, a peace of soul. And I think standing here in this room, we get a sense of that peace too. Newman may have entered the fullness of faith, but this would be no harbour of quietness and tranquillity. There would be many trials ahead, and to start off with, the new convert had to prepare for ordination as a Catholic priest. He was sent to Rome and confessed to feeling like a child going to a new school. In 1848, Newman set up his oratory at Old Oscott on the outskirts of Birmingham. He renamed it Maryvale, after St. Philip's great church in Rome, Santa Maria in Vallicella, Our Lady in the Little Valley. Well, it's really good to be here because I know that you teach here, and I haven't really been here properly before, so what is there to see?
Well, I'll show you around. It's an important place, and the Maryvale Institute today continues Newman's work. It's fitting that it's here because Newman came here immediately after his own conversion. And then, after he was ordained a priest in Rome, this is where he first came. This is where the oratory was founded. This is where Newman's Catholic life began. Just coming here, it looks like just an ordinary bedroom.
Nothing special, really.
And yet, this is where Newman lived when he was here. This is where the Catholic Newman began.
And we know that for sure, do we?
The reason we know it is because there's a window looking down upon the chapel, and he describes the little window. It's hidden in this little cubby hole here. It's like a wardrobe.
It's like a priest's hiding hole, isn't it?
That's right. And there's a little kneeler here. You can look down onto the chapel and say your prayers.
And that sort of reminds me that Newman does mention how important it was for him as a new Catholic to be in the same house as our Lord in the Blessed Sacrament. And when he went to Rome, he talked about how the divine presence was almost looking out from the churches onto the streets through the doors. So the real presence was really important for him.
And he had it really here, so close.
Just below his bedroom.
Next to the Blessed Sacrament, literally. So much of the old building has survived here, and this place has deep Catholic roots.
And this was actually the site of the first Catholic seminary in England since the Reformation. It was founded here in 1794. And just before Newman moved here, they had gone to a new premises, the new Oscott, just down the road.
A very important site, and there's something even more important through here. So you're entering the oldest English shrine to the Sacred Heart. This image of our Lord in the Sacred Heart, inspired by visions of St. Gertrude, was brought here by Bishop Milner in 1814. It was even cracked, and the crack is still there on its journey here, but it became an important shrine to the Sacred Heart.
So it's the first shrine as such to the Sacred Heart in England.
Yes.
Of course, in the 17th century, St. Claude de la Colombière, the spiritual director to St. Margaret Mary, had preached the Sacred Heart in London, in St. James's Palace. But this is really this new devotion flourishing during the Second Spring, the first shrine in England.
Yes, and this is something Newman would have known, and Newman would have prayed here.
So very quickly he's becoming connected to this very distinctively Catholic piety.
Yes, this world of Catholic devotion, and that the importance of the Sacred Heart is very much present in the Stations of the Cross that he writes, the outpouring of Christ's love in his passion.
So Maryvale in a way acts as a bridge as Newman gets to know this new Catholic community, as he's being linked with its recent history and he's being linked with these devotions.
Yes, it's an important bridge moment for him.
Maryvale today boasts a college and several religious communities, including the Sisters of the Blessed Virgin Mary. They originated from an Anglican order that had been founded in 1848. Now these sisters come under the personal ordinariate of Our Lady of Walsingham, and we've come to meet Mother Winsome.
Blessed John Henry Newman is important for the ordinariate because he's been a trailblazer. He has beaten a path for those who came after him, firstly as an Anglican becoming a Catholic, where he had to make sacrifices, lose friends, and he did it in such a splendid, clear way that those who came after haven't had to be trailblazers themselves. They've followed a path which he's already prepared. He's been a shining example for members of the ordinariate. They know what he went through, and they too have experienced it in terms of losing friends, having people turn against them, having people not understand, and the very real practical sacrifices of giving up homes, jobs, career prospects, all for the sake of knowing they were doing God's will, which in a sense is the best reason under heaven. From my perspective, I feel John Henry Newman is important for today because he symbolises truth and conscience, things which are timeless. They don't change. His whole journey from being an Anglican to being a Catholic centred around truth, what for him was the full truth. And he didn't allow his conscience to be wavered in any way. He stuck quite clearly to what he saw was God's will for him, and he couldn't live with anything other than a clear conscience, and he made that transition. And if I had to summarize his life in 2 words, it would be truth and conscience. And that applies to Christians and others today. He's a real beacon of hope for anyone who is looking for the truth and wants to find the truth in accordance with their conscience.
If the Creator comes on earth in the form of a servant and a creature, why may not his mother, on the other hand, rise to be the Queen of Heaven, and be clothed with the sun, and have the moon under her feet?
So like many saints and holy men, Newman has often been misunderstood, hasn't he? And he's been hijacked by certain groups. Sometimes people say that he's a liberal, and they sometimes mention the fact that he opposed the definition of papal infallibility by Pius IX.
I think that's a misunderstanding, because the reason Newman didn't want the definition to go forward at that moment, in his opinion, was because of a certain conservatism, a caution that people weren't ready for the definition. It wasn't that he didn't believe the Pope had the authority to pronounce on doctrine. And I think Newman makes it very clear, he's very categorical, that he's opposed to liberalism in religion. He says when he becomes a cardinal, for 30, 40, 50 years, I have opposed the spirit of liberalism in religion, by which he means, is very specific, by which he means the spirit that says one creed is as good as another, and that you can't find truth in religion.
And we see that in Newman the Anglican, don't we? And in the rationale behind the Oxford movement.
His whole life is this search for truth. I think people sometimes see him as a liberal thinker because he's not conventional, and that's a different thing. He's not simply using the simple scholastic statements. He's not answering the questions that everyone wants to answer, but he's asking and answering the real questions of his day.
And that's why occasionally he came under suspicion, didn't he, from the church? People were thinking, what is this Newman saying? Can we really trust him? Is he truly Catholic?
Because even within the Catholic Church, people were suspicious because he didn't fall within the usual categories. He was dealing with all the latest problems, faith and science. His greatest works are about the relationship between faith and reason in the Grammar of Assent. How is it possible to believe in this age when faith is something bigger than our minds, when so many believe who do not fully understand? And he wrestles with this problem, which is psychological, philosophical, and also his other great apologetic work, we can call it, is the development of Christian doctrine. He says it's a hypothesis to account for a difficulty. The difficulty being that the church seems to change through the ages. Doctrine seems to change. Is that a corruption? The liberal modernist argument is that it is. And Newman says, no, you can have development without corruption, like an acorn becoming a tree, like a boy becoming a man. And simply Christian doctrine grows wider and larger in its articulation while remaining essentially the same.
So in these issues, he really is quite a pioneer, isn't he? He's quite an original thinker within the orthodox belief of the Church. And also he's tackling the issues of the day.
Absolutely, and I always think of Newman as the supreme apologist. At Mary Vale, where he set up his oratory, it continues today to educate the laity, as do other places, to teach the defence of the faith, the hope that is in us. And here at Mary Vale, Newman is taught as an apologist and inspires answers to today's questions that are also difficult. The same old answers aren't always possible, the same formulations do not always satisfy, but the same truth remains and it is accessible.
And we're all called to follow in his footsteps, aren't we, as best we can, and to try and be apologists and to proclaim the faith in our modern world.
Each in our own way, and that's the inspiration of Newman. And in his Biglietto speech, when he became cardinal again, he said, in a future age we will face an apostasia. He foresaw a time when culture did not support Christianity, and each Christian would have to be strong and faithful and would need to know their faith and the answers, the relation of truth to truth, as he says.
Newman dreamt of founding an oratory in Oxford, but this was never possible in his lifetime. Eventually, his dream was fulfilled in 1993. We've come to speak with Father Daniel, the current provost, about Newman's life as a Catholic.
When Newman became a Catholic in 1845, that was simply without any conditions, and he didn't know really what his future would be. And then he and some of his other companions went out to Rome to study for the priesthood. And it was in Rome that they looked around at different possibilities. They looked at the Dominicans and decided that wasn't quite the thing for them, same with the Jesuits, and there was some thought of starting up again a defunct religious order from England, the Gilbertines. And then, almost by chance, or we'd say providence, Newman stumbled upon the Chiesa Nuova and the oratory. And it wasn't so much that he was impressed with the oratory as it existed then in the 1840s in Rome. More, he managed to grasp very quickly the idea of the oratory. He discovered St. Philip, and one can't emphasize enough that St. Philip is the key factor always for an oratorian, that his personality, his charism was what Newman brought to England. He said that St. Philip reminded him of his friend John Keble with his joyfulness, his playfulness, his not taking life too seriously. And what Newman realised is that he could, in the oratory, keep himself and his friends together. Had he just been on his own, he might well have become a Benedictine or anything else, really. But instead he realised that he had to find something where they could stay together as a group. He had that responsibility as a leader. And what he found in the oratory was something which he thought was rather like an Oxford college in his day. At that time, remember, the fellows of Oxford colleges were still celibate, and so they lived together in community, and they had a common life, they ate together and they prayed together. And this was what Newman saw as ideal for the English temperament in the oratorian life. Something which didn't have too much structure, but had that sense of home. And he writes how the Italians don't really have a word for home as distinct from house, but St. Philip had invented one because he called the room of an oratorian father a nido, a nest. And what's so striking about Newman is that once he moved to Birmingham, the Birmingham Oratory had to move about a little bit to begin with before it found a permanent home. But that's where he stuck. Just like St. Philip moving to Rome as a young man, stayed in Rome for the rest of his life. Newman found his home in Birmingham, not the place we would have expected him to go, a big industrial city, at that time still emerging, and as Newman himself said, it wasn't really a centre in the sense that Oxford or London were then centres. But when he was criticised for sticking in Birmingham, he said, Birmingham people have souls. And he felt that Providence had directed him to go there, to love those people, to serve them in their needs and difficulties, and to make a home there. And that's a great testament to the power of St. Philip to lead somebody in a way that they didn't expect to go.
In 1849, Newman and his Oratorian community moved to a poor area in central Birmingham. 3 years later, he moved again to Edgbaston, then a pleasant suburb to the west of the city. Living on the Hagley Road, he remained a dedicated priest. So this is obviously the refectory, and it's lined with portraits of famous oratorians. Would Newman have known this refectory?
Yes, he would have done. Yes, the layout of the refectory is very much as he would have known it. Obviously the floor's different and that it's been redecorated a couple of times.
And where would Newman have been sitting?
Newman would have sat over there. That's where Newman and all subsequent provosts of the oratory have sat during the formal meals.
So eating was very much like a ritual for
yes,
Newman
it was very much so. There's a conference of his in extant in which he says that the formal meal is one of the main religious acts of the day of the oratory. So that's why we have a pulpit, where we have readings from spiritual books, the life of St. Philip, and why there's grace before meals, grace after meals. It's very much a religious act.
So in a way, the refectory is an extension of the church?
Indeed, yes, very much so. I think he specifically says that. So. Oh, this is Newman's library.
Oh, wonderful. This is exactly the sort of library I would love to have.
Yeah.
And are these mostly Newman's books?
Yes, most of them. Certainly the ones on the lower part are all ones that he collected, right, from his time.
Patristic books from his time in Oxford and
Yes,
Littlemore.
yes. A lot of them, of course, were taken from convents which were not wanting their books anymore after the French Revolution. So.
And are there any other mementos of Newman in here?
Yes, well, this desk here, this tall writing desk, is where he wrote the Apologia Pro Vita Sua, one of his most famous works and one of the most famous spiritual...
So he wrote standing at the desk?
Yes, and he often, it is recorded in his letters that there was one time when he wrote solidly here for 22 hours a day.
Gosh, that's quite amazing.
Because he had the printer standing outside there for the proof, so...
And then this looks like a violin case.
Yeah, it's his viola.
People forget that he was a very musical man.
He was. It's recorded in the Apologia that he was playing the viola, maybe even this viola, when the news of his election to Oriel came around.
Really? So it accompanied him through his life?
Yes, and he often, he played Beethoven quartets when Beethoven was still alive. And when that was new music, so yes.
And he composed music as well, didn't he?
Yes, there.
Hymns and...
Yes, in our hymn book there are a few hymn tunes which he wrote, often in a very popular style. So it's not very highfalutin, but he's...
He always makes me think a bit of Sherlock Holmes, actually, this sort of intellectual giant playing his violin in his study.
Yes, he would have done, yes. I've never thought of Newman as Sherlock Holmes before, but perhaps it's a good analogy.
So what is this, Father Richard?
This is a facsimile of the manuscript score of Elgar's The Dream of Gerontius. One of most Newman's famous works and one of Elgar's, the peers.
Combination
yes,
of two great Catholics.
And he says here, I offer this to the library of the oratory with the deepest reverence to the memory of Cardinal Newman, whose poem I have had the honour to set to music. September the 17th, 1902.
So about 12 years after Newman's death.
Yes.
And it's such a Catholic poem, isn't it? Explaining purgatory and how it's something positive that the soul would want to enter the glory of heaven.
Take me away and there let me be in the lowest deep. And you can see at the parts of the score. You see, this is the Devil's Chorus here. Look at it, it's quite frantic, as if he could hardly wait to get over with it. And just along here will be the climax of the whole work, the praise to the holiest.
which became the popular hymn.
Yes, you see.
It was first written for this piece.
Yes, it was.
And you also have...
Yes, here's the climax, Praise to the Holiest, where there's fortissimo.
And it makes you realise that Newman isn't just a dry academic. He also communicates through poetry and lyricism and wonderfully vivid imagery.
Poetry was part of his life right from his Anglican days in the Lyra Apostolica and the poems he wrote even as an Anglo-Catholic to try and convey Catholic sense of doctrine.
And of course he also communicated via novels, didn't he, like Callista and
Loss and Gain, yes.
There are no short ways to perfection, but there are sure ones. He then is perfect who does the work of the day perfectly, and we need not go beyond this to seek for perfection.
Well, this is Blessed John Henry Newman's study.
It's almost as if he's just left the room for a moment.
Yes, it hasn't changed an awful lot since then. Wallpaper's the same. Haven't even installed electricity in here, so it is very much as he left it. These are all the books that he used a lot.
And I suppose he sat there writing letters.
Yes.
That was a key part of his apostolate.
Yes, he wrote 17,000 letters or thereabouts, but new ones keep turning up, so we never quite got a tab of them.
Yeah, about 34 volumes of his letters have
yes,
been
34 volumes.
He's one of the great letter writers, isn't he, of the English language?
Yes,
So many.
I suppose today he'd be using emails.
Or a blog, yes, or Twitter. No, I don't think Twitter would be his.
Not for Newman.
No, it's no. He would have been. He would have seen it as an apostolate, writing letters, because they were, a lot of them were for people who had troubled consciences on one issue or another, and he took great time and courtesy even to respond to them.
So he wasn't just an aloof academic, he was speaking to the hearts of individual people.
He was a pastor, he was a priest above all, he was a priest above everything else, and that was the key to his identity, a priest and an oratorian.
And really quite a humble room for a cardinal of the church, as he was in his later years.
Yes, it was, yes. Yes, you think it's quite exposed. It's on the road, although the road wouldn't have been as busy as it is now, but it's quite an exposed room. There's no electricity in it, no facilities for making tea or coffee or any of the luxuries that we take for granted nowadays.
And he had a private chapel within this room as well.
Yes, it's just round the corner if you
Let's go and have a look.
care to follow me.
And that was a special privilege for a cardinal.
Yes. This is his private chapel. Set up for Mass, as it should have been.
And with St. Francis de Sales above the altar.
Yes.
And it was from St. Francis's writings that wonderful motto, heart speaking to heart,
Cor loquitur, yes. And as you can see, all these pictures and cards on the right here are friends of his, people who had asked him for his prayers. So he had them literally by the altar as he was saying Mass.
It's also very personal, isn't
it?
And Newman would have said Mass here, I suppose, most days. And did he celebrate his last Mass here?
Yes, this would have been where he celebrated his last Mass on Christmas Day 1889. And he was so frail that his hand wobbled as he elevated the chalice. And he said to William Neville, his private secretary, he said, never again, never again. But every day after that, he celebrated a dry Mass here, to say, without the consecration, in the hope that one day he would be strong enough to do it again. But no, this is where he celebrated his last Mass, and as you can see, it's occasionally used for Masses here.
And when Pope Benedict came to visit England, he came to this room.
He did indeed, yes. There's the photographs of him sitting at the desks there and standing right there and taking it all in. And you could tell he wanted to stay longer, but there was Fray Monsignor Genswein was looking at his watch every 5 minutes, and as were the anxious archbishops outside in the corridor, saying he's got to get to Oscott.
And
No.
Newman would never have guessed that one day the Pope himself would come into his rooms.
No, he wouldn't. No.
And the Pope Pope Benedict was a great fan of Newman's.
Yes. We got some manuscripts out of the library to show the Holy Father. They're down in the sacristy, and he got his glasses out, and again he was peering at them, and the Monsignori were getting anxious about the time he was spending. He was only supposed to spend 20 minutes here, but he spent nearly 3/4 of an hour in the end of the day. So.
Well, it's not often that we sit in a saint's room, and just as in Newman's time there's no electricity, you can really imagine him suddenly coming in.
Yeah, there's a certain ambience here, isn't there, and an atmosphere. People think of saints as distant figures you can't really relate to, but you can imagine Newman just sat here right now because everything is as he left it.
And often people think that Newman was distant, and certainly he was a great academic, but that didn't mean that he wasn't good with people, that he wasn't concerned about people's souls, that he wasn't absolutely pastoral.
Yes, this is a man who probably in this room was writing one of the great theological tomes like the Grammar of Assent. At the same time, he was writing hundreds of letters every week to people he cared about and individuals who sought his help. The personal was primary for him.
And speaking as a priest, Newman is such an inspiration. I mean, it's often forgotten that here in Birmingham, Newman was visiting the workhouse, he was visiting the poor, he went to help one priest in a parish during a cholera epidemic, and even the year before he died, Newman went to the local chocolate factory run by the Cadbury brothers, who were Quakers, and the Catholic workers there were complaining that they had to go to a Bible class, which was perhaps threatening to their Catholicism, and Newman went along and argued their case, but also was enormously Christian towards the Cadbury brothers, who commented on that later.
People often forget this side of Newman, and people also don't realise that he was a very humble man. He didn't think of himself as a saint.
No, in fact, he once said, I'm not a saint. Saints who write novels, people who write novels don't get to heaven. And he said that even if he did get to heaven, he'd probably be blacking the shoes of a saint like St. Philip.
It's quite a thought. And for him, holiness wasn't about the great things, the great deeds. It was about simple steps in ordinary life, in our vocation, steps towards holiness. He writes a famous passage about simply fulfilling God's will, getting up at the right time, doing our prayers, practicing charity.
Newman is an absolute realist. He believes in grace building upon nature. He was fully aware of his own weaknesses. He was very sensitive. He could easily feel offended, and he struggled with these weaknesses. He often talked about walking to heaven backwards, despite
Yes.
one's sins and failings and temptations.
This is quite helpful because we often think of sanctity as unachievable, but with Newman there are clear weaknesses and imperfections, and yet despite those, and in a sense through those, he becomes holy.
Praise to the Holy
Newman's contribution was wide-ranging, but one would have to say that he always remained an educator. This was his first work, and throughout his life he sought to help others know their faith. When Newman first founded the oratory, one of his initial acts was to found a school so that Catholics could receive an education as good as any other. This oratory school still exists today near Reading, and we've come to speak with Dr. Andrew Nash, a retired head teacher and a Newman scholar.
Catholics in England in those days didn't have the equivalent of the big public schools like Eton and Winchester. There were sort of Catholic poor schools, there were seminaries for trainee priests, and Catholic young men were sometimes sent to those. But obviously those were they weren't really ideal for someone who wasn't going on for the priesthood. And in particular, the Oxford movement had brought into the church middle-class, educated Catholics who had themselves been to the great public schools. And now they'd become Catholics. They wanted something equivalent for their sons, and there wasn't anything. So they said to Newman, would you found a Catholic public school? And Newman said yes. And so he founded what became the Oratory School, attached to the Oratory in Birmingham. He bought a house and he did various later architectural adaptations, and it opened on the Feast of St. Athanasius, 2nd of May, in 1859. Newman always intended that it wouldn't stay in Birmingham because, of course, Birmingham was growing up to be the very big industrial city that we know today. He intended it would move out to a site in the countryside, which it did after his death in the 1920s. It moved down into the Berkshire countryside, first of all just outside Reading in Caversham Park, and it was there for about 20 years, and then it was evacuated during the war and ended up on this site in what's now South Oxfordshire, here at Woodcote. This building became available. It was absolutely tiny by that stage because it had suffered all sort of financially and so on, but it had kept going, and they were very conscious we're Newman's school. And it regrew and flourished. Newman thought that the first step of education, or perhaps not the first, the very primary, but at school level, is very much should be teaching a discipline of the mind. That before, in fact, you can think your very original thoughts and so on, you need to, it's not simply knowing the basics, but you've got to have that intellectual training which enables you to think rigorously, think critically, what we call, in fact, critical thinking today. And that this is not necessarily narrowly vocational. It may not be leading you to a particular job in medicine or technology or whatever it is, but that it gives to people an educated mind which is capable of sifting evidence, considering it carefully, thinking about it critically, and that everybody needs that. Newman was a great champion of the laity. What he was doing in education at the university and here at the Oratory School was producing an educated laity. And he could see, long before Vatican II talked about the apostolate of the laity and all that we're very familiar with today, Newman could see that the great need of the modern age, and the modern age really began in the 19th century, intellectually and culturally, was for an educated Catholic laity. So his message for us today is that we laity, we must educate ourselves. We should all educate ourselves that we can give an intelligent, rational explanation of our faith. And that does mean some reading, some hard reading. It does mean getting involved in historical issues as well as the doctrinal ones, and understanding when there's controversy in the media today. What is of the essence of the faith? What are the disciplinary things which can change, perhaps should change, but what's at the heart of our faith? And is the truth delivered to us by our Lord and taught through in the church? So I think he's a great challenge for laity, and he's also a great inspiration, and many lay people who feel a great affection for Newman. He's such an attractive personality. The story of his life, his wonderful autobiography, the Apologia Pro Vita Sua, which has also got some great theology in as well. I think these are things which can be very, very helpful for lay people today in the world.
As old age set in, it seemed that the dark cloud that had long overshadowed Newman was beginning to disappear. Much to his surprise, on the 12th of May 1879, he was created a cardinal by Pope Leo XIII. It was a recognition of a lifetime service to the Church. His last decade appeared to have been a happy one, although his health was fast declining, and he finally died on the 11th of August 1890 at the age of 89. We've returned to Birmingham to visit the beautiful shrine chapel at the oratory. So here we are in the shrine chapel at the Birmingham oratory, and it reminds us just how popular Newman is. All around the world there are Newman societies, Newman associations, places where he is remembered and celebrated.
There's been devotion to Newman from the day he died, and it's grown over time, and this now is the epicenter of devotion to him. It's his official shrine.
And this is where people don't simply read about him, they actually pray for his intercession.
Because there are relics here, and relics are quite rare of Newman. There's some of his hair here. And relics give us the contact with the saint. The physical contact is really important because we're human and we need that.
And all of us use relics ourselves in a way, don't we? We have mementos of our loved ones, pictures, possessions, things belonging to them, and they are a tangible link to their memory.
Yes, these relics are very important.
But over here we have a particularly important relic. As you said, relics of Newman are very, very rare. And this is one of the only pieces of bone belonging to John Henry Newman. When Blessed John Henry Newman was buried, they poured a substance over the tomb which accelerated the process of decomposition.
There's a kind of humility in that, isn't there?
It was at the Cardinal's request. He wanted to really disappear from the world and go into the eternity that he so firmly believed in.
So very little actually survives.
When they exhumed his body in preparation for the beatification, they found very, very little. But this is one of the few parts of his remains that they did find.
And so when people come here, this is a real focus, and I believe there's a little drawer down here where people can place their petitions to the saint.
And in fact, I've got my own petition here. I've got a few things I want to pray for, so I'm going to put it in this box.
Very good, and we'll ask for his powerful intercession.
There are two worlds, the visible and the invisible, as the Creed speaks. The world we see and the world we do not see. And yet, in spite of this universal world which we see, there is another world, quite as far-spreading, quite as close to us, and more wonderful.
In September 2010, Pope Benedict XVI beatified Newman, and we've come to visit the venue for this great occasion in Cofton Park, just outside Birmingham. So here we are in Cofton Park on the outskirts of Birmingham, and I must say it's nice to see it in the sun.
Yes, the day when we were both here last was the beatification of John Henry Newman, a great day for English Catholicism, but it was raining.
And you remember, just as the Pope came out for Mass, that's when, thankfully, the sun came out.
And then I remember the 70,000 people here. After he was declared to be blessed, they sang praise to the holiest in the heights.
Cofton Park would have been known by Newman and the fathers of the oratory, and just down the road at Rednall was their country house and was also the final resting place of Newman.
Yes, that's where the last remaining relics came, from that humble grave and a few things that were buried with him. He realized there was another world greater than this one, that God and the angels and the saints were surrounding this world of color and sight and sound, that actually was the real world, and this was the world of shadows. His actual epitaph on his grave was, out of the shadows and imaginations into reality. And he drew this from the fathers of the church and from the Bible, that our true homeland is heaven.
Yes, and ever since that conversion in 1816, he was so aware of that divine presence in his life, leading him through everything. He was also aware, wasn't he, of that vocation that we all have, that divine purpose, that all of us have a little part in God's plan for the world.
This runs through Newman's life like a golden chain, that God had created him for a purpose. And obviously we see his purpose as being a great intellectual guide. He was a great pastor, and maybe in the future he'll be a doctor of the church. He said, I may not know why I am created now, but I will know one day. And we're seeing that still unfold today.
God has created me to do him some definite service. He has committed some work to me which he has not committed to another. I have my mission. I may never know it in this life, but I shall be told it in the next. He has not created me for nothing. I shall do good. I shall do his work. I shall be an angel of peace, a preacher of truth in my own place. Deign to fulfill your high purposes in me. I am here to serve you, to be yours, to be your instrument. Amen.